Hello, this is Conscious TV. My name is Ian McNay. This is another programme in our series on non-duality, and our guest today is Richard Sylvester. Hi, Richard.
Hello.
And so Richard has 2 books out with the Non-Duality Press, talking about non-duality, and we're just going to talk to Richard a little bit about his life and where he is and how he sees things. So maybe we start, Richard, we were just talking earlier, and I asked you, when did you kind of start searching, if you like, and you were saying about 30 years ago.
30, 35 years.
And I wonder what triggered that. Why did you... Most people don't really make a conscious search in life. What triggered it in you?
Well, I suppose I feel that nearly all of us are searching in some ways, but not necessarily in a, let's say, a spiritual or philosophical way. People are searching to make their lives work in some way or other. But I think in my case, as I think with quite a lot of other people, the reason it probably started to take a specifically spiritual direction, if you like, was because of a certain amount of unhappiness, discontent, feeling that whatever life was offering on the ordinary level, let's say, wasn't really cutting it. So I think, as with a lot of people probably, if I gave a single word answer to that question, it would be discontent.
So life wasn't giving you enough somehow?
Life was giving me a lot, and it wasn't enough.
Yeah, no, I understand that. Yeah.
The usual things, relationship, job, certain amount of economic comfort, home, all of these things, and yet there was still a pretty profound feeling of discontent. And so, like a lot of people, I began to sort of gradually look. I suppose we're talking about the late 60s or 70s, so I suppose it was natural to start looking maybe towards the East and towards meditative practices and things like that at the time. They seemed to offer out some hope for the kind of satisfaction that ordinary life didn't seem to be providing.
And what was your starting point in terms of technique or practices that you did?
Well, after a certain amount of dabbling around with books on Buddhism and some very failed attempts to teach myself to meditate, I took myself off, like many, many other people at the time, I took myself off to transcendental meditation.
I did that as well.
Yeah. And I loved that, and that only lasted for 2 years, but that really got me started. I mean, I absolutely. I thought it was a fantastic thing to do at the time.
You had the mantra that you repeated
Absolutely.
silently in 20 minutes in the morning and 20 minutes in the evening.
Yeah.
And that kind of calmed you down, did you feel?
It had a pretty instantaneous and profound effect. Pretty much like they say, it was both very calming, very relaxing, but also on another level, it stirred things up a lot, which I think it's probably designed to do. It kind of brings to the surface that which is hidden within, and it was probably my first, I wouldn't have described it in those terms at the time, but it was probably my first meeting with what later on I would describe as my own shadow, my first conscious meeting with my own shadow, I would say.
Yeah, when I did TM, I found it a little bit the same. It stirred things up, and I couldn't find within the TM movement a way of addressing those, so I moved on to something else.
It sounds quite similar with me.
So what did you move on to?
Well, I moved on to, I'm going to call it a guru cult. I moved on to a guru cult for the next 3 years, which again was fantastic. It was great fun, very powerful techniques, lots of things happening, lots of entertainment, and also lots of feeling that now I'm really getting somewhere. I'm on a path now which seems to be working. But going back to what you just said, there was also this feeling of all sorts of things are being stirred up which aren't really being dealt with, and which it became more and more obvious weren't going to be dealt with in that way. And I think that's when I started getting interested in, let's call it the Western psychotherapeutic path.
Right, yeah.
Which again, at that time, historically, a lot of people were doing the same thing. So a lot of people who'd been involved in, let's say, the Eastern transpersonal movements were also getting involved with the Western psychotherapy movements, particularly the humanistic side, because that seemed to go very well somehow with the lights and colour of the guru paths.
And you were based in London at the time, were you?
I was based in London at the time, so there was ample opportunity to go off and spend enormous amounts of money having great fun on all sorts of different high-intensity courses, yeah.
Was this around the time of Community and Kaleidoscope?
Well, it was around the time of EST, for example, an organisation which I became very connected with for a short time was called Self-Transformations, which sort of burnt very brightly for a very brief period of time at that time. I'm just trying to remember. I suppose that must have been in the late 70s, very early 80s. Right. And of course there were lots and lots of other groups around, springing up in California, travelling across the Atlantic to us, springing up in London.
It was exciting great time because it was all so new, absolutely. Wasn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it really did seem to be providing that which ordinary life, I'll call it that again, hadn't been providing. It seemed to be fulfilling that need to feel that we were getting somewhere other than simply accumulating wealth, family, house.
I find a different dimension of looking at things, and it questioned your values, but gave you somewhere ideas of where to look.
Absolutely, and of course the other element in that, which I'm forgetting to throw in, of course, also, which had an enormous effect on many of us, was of course the meeting with hallucinogenic drugs as well. I mean, that was also. Okay. So I mean, there were three ways in which suddenly there was this sort of huge expansion of what life seemed to be about and what consciousness seemed to consist of. There was the meditative paths, there was the psychotherapy, and there was a good kick in the head from a few doses of LSD as well for many people at that time, many people.
So did you at that point see yourself on a quest for enlightenment as such, or whatever you felt was enlightenment?
Oh, absolutely. Without having with there being no possibility whatsoever of my knowing what that was, nevertheless constructing all sorts of idealised stories about it, and absolutely feeling that was somehow, somewhere, the goal at the end. The mysterious end of this mysterious path.
Well, the carrots were being dangled, weren't they?
Absolutely.
And you felt that.
Absolutely, yeah.
And did you feel close at some point, or did you feel, this is I'm starting to get there, or did you feel it was like a game you enjoyed playing?
It was certainly a game that I enjoyed playing, and I think again, like many people, like many other people, there were I would call them now extraordinary experiences. There were extraordinary experiences which, because of the stories about personal enlightenment, because of the things I'd read, because of the people I'd listened to, seemed to be like signposts on the path. As as the sort of one of the traditional metaphors has it, they seem to be like that. At the time, it was impossible for me not to see them in that way. And these are in a sense they're common experiences that many people have and describe. Feelings of expansiveness and increased awareness of love, and many people would describe such experiences.
And you were working as a psychologist at this time?
I was working as a lecturer.
Yeah.
At that time, and getting increasingly involved with teaching in the field of therapy and counselling at the time, at the same time.
So, and at some point you started to go to lectures by Tony Parsons.
I did indeed.
Am I leaving out a huge chunk by saying
Not
that?
Not at all. No, you're leaving nothing of any importance out whatsoever.
All right.
At a certain point, I did indeed, yes.
And why were you drawn to Tony?
It was a very strange thing, actually. I went to see Tony once, a long time ago. Not long after he started giving public talks, and I was invited there by somebody I knew, and I thought he was okay, I liked him, thought what he was saying was interesting, and had absolutely no desire to go back whatsoever at that time, and no interest in going back at all. Just went away and forgot it and thought, I don't want yet another spiritual path, as I might have described it at the time. And it was some time later, probably maybe as much as 2 years later, I can't really remember, when there was a bit of a strange synchronicity which took me back. So there was maybe something like a 2-year gap between my first visit and my second visit to him. What happened was that, purely by coincidence, 2 different people that I knew mentioned that he had a meeting coming up in Hampstead and invited me to it. And they made it sound quite fun, with talk of eating and drinking afterwards. So it sounded quite attractive. So I thought, what the hell, I'll go along again. So I went for that second time, and I can't really explain it. Just something clicked. And I found myself going back after that, again and again. Just something about the energy, something about what he was saying. I mean, I certainly couldn't understand it at the time, but nevertheless, there was something about it. It used to provoke pretty strong feelings in me, of a variety of contradictory feelings, a variety of feelings, but I just found myself going back after that. That's partly because it was such fun. I mean, it was fun to be at the meetings. I loved the energy. I loved his energy, and it was a fun thing to do afterwards.
And were you relatively happy in your life at the time?
I was I was no more unhappy than I'd been at any other point in the 30 years of seeking. I would say probably on the scale of happy to unhappy, I was probably pretty much the same as I'd been at any other point in my in those 30 years of seeking. But going to see Tony and then hanging out with a nice crowd of people, eating and drinking afterwards, was kind of one of the high points.
Yeah, no, I can understand that.
Time. Yeah. It was very simple, very basic. I think I liked the simplicity of it.
And you felt there was kindred spirits in the meetings there?
Yes, yeah, I felt there were kindred spirits, yes. And I suppose by then, I don't think I would have been fully conscious of this at the time, but I think looking back, I think by then I had already internally started to turn away from all the very, very complex spiritual stories that I'd sniffed around, as it were. I kind of flirted with a lot of things, Tibetan Buddhism, for example, various yogic philosophies, and they all seem so complicated. And I think somewhere inside me there was beginning to grow the glimmering of a thought that, if there really is something that I'm missing, and I mean, I was by no means certain that there was, but if there was something that I was missing, then I was beginning to suspect that it was something very, very simple indeed, but something which for some reason I just couldn't get.
I think you said something very significant there about simplicity, yeah. So, and then there's this, you talked about, we were joking about earlier, you talk about in your book about Charing Cross Station, Platform 5.
Yes.
And something seemed to happen there.
Yes. I don't know whether to say that Charing Cross Station Platform 5 is in a highly significant place or to suggest that it's completely irrelevant, but one or the other or somewhere in between those two, yes. It was just a momentary event, I'll call it. I mean, probably a split-second event. But when I describe it as when I came back after it, because it was just an event in which there was a complete and total disappearance of the person in every way. And not in the way that I felt I had experienced it through meditation, where the person had kind of thinned and become translucent and so forth, but everything else had thinned and become translucent because I was in meditation. Not like that. Nothing changed. Absolutely nothing changed. Good old Charing Cross Station just went on being good old Charing Cross Station. The only difference was that I wasn't in it. And that was probably a split second. And then I was back, and there was the recognition that something very significant seemed to have happened, although I didn't understand what it was.
So when you came back, or you felt you were back, apart from the thought there was something significant happened, was there a feeling? Was there a feeling, expansion, fear? It was just simple.
Absolutely. I mean, this is why I say it's so difficult to describe. It's so different from what I would describe as the sort of spiritual experiences that, you know, as I say, I and many people have on meditative paths and so forth. It was it's a paradigm shift. It had no connection with that. It wasn't like that, but more intense in any way whatsoever. It was a different paradigm. There was none of that. I sometimes call those meditative experiences kind of pink and fluffy, and you know, it's a feeling of expansion and love and so forth. Nothing like that at all. Absolutely nothing. Nothing changed. The only difference was that suddenly there was no person in it, and it seemed to become clear that the person isn't a necessity.
The person isn't a necessity.
Yeah. I suppose for however many years, I can't remember how old I was, but whatever, for 57, 58 years, there had been an unconscious, I'll call it an assumption, really, an unconscious absolute certainty and knowing that the person is, of course, a necessity, because the person is the centre of everything that happens. And without the person as its centre, nothing can happen. And in that split second, that totally disappeared. It was completely seen through. The person is not a necessity.
So it was like a realisation through an experience, but then the person was back.
Yeah. I avoid, I don't know whether it matters, I avoid using the word experience, because for me an experience is something that happens to a person. So I don't know if it helps to clarify it or not, but I would, you know, I call this an event.
Okay, event,
and
yeah.
then the personal experience comes back, but somewhat, both somewhat in a state of shock and also somewhat changed. But nevertheless, still back and still unhappy and still searching. In my case, anyway.
Okay.
And having talked to other people about this, I think again this is common. This is common. There can be a moment of awakening, and then when the person comes back, well, not only can things be as bad as before, in some ways they can be worse.
Because you've had a glimpse of something else.
You've had a glimpse of something else, it's gone, there's no way back to it that you can discover. And what may happen, what happened for me, and I know it's happened for other people, is that split second has blown the cover of all the spiritual techniques. It's made them all seem redundant. So one of the ways in which, when the person comes back, things can actually seem to be worse is that there's no hope now. 30 years of searching, there was hope.
And then there's no hope.
And then
that's
after
desperate
this,
stuff.
there was no hope, because there was a seeing that all of that was just irrelevant. All of those experiences, all of those techniques. I mean, they're great for the person, wonderful for making the person feel more comfortable in all sorts of ways, but they have no relevance to, well, I'll call it liberation or awakening or whatever word we want to use. I mean, all the words, none of the words are good words.
But what influence did that have in your life then? So you've had this glimpse, or you've had this happening, awakening, whatever you call it, and then person's back.
There was more despair.
I understand, yeah.
Certain things did become easier. And again, talking to other people, I think this is common, not necessarily universal by any means, but common, because the person that comes back does seem to be changed in some ways, and certain things. Well, one thing, for example, that I write about is that it seems that time, or the importance of time, the importance of the past and the importance of the future, let me say, is to a certain extent seen through. it can't be taken terribly seriously anymore. So in that sense, maybe there was, you could say, less cause for personal suffering, because there was less, how can I put it, there was less of an impulse to visit the past constantly with regret, nostalgia, anger, maybe resentment. There was less impulse to visit the future.
So, but when you
with
say
fear or with hope. So in that sense, you could say things got a bit easier, but in other ways they got more difficult because there was more despair now.
So when you say there was less impulse to visit the past or visit the future, like the thoughts of the past or future would come, and somehow you wouldn't energise them, you wouldn't cling on to them, or okay.
Well, they wouldn't have they would not have energy to them. They would come, they would drift in, they would drift out again. They wouldn't be clung to. They had less energy.
Okay.
But there was more despair.
Yeah.
More
what form did that despair take?
I don't know that it took any particular form. It was just...
I mean, was it depression and hopelessness, or was it anger, or I know for myself there's different kinds of... different forms it takes, despair.
I think despair is the word I'll stick with. I think despair is very different to depression. I wouldn't call it depression. I wouldn't say that feelings like anger or sadness or fear, those uncomfortable feelings, I wouldn't say they particularly got stronger or weaker at that time. They just went on as before. So I will stick to despair. I did invent a word. I don't know if this fits. I did. I remember I used to say to people, they asked me how I was. I said, well, I'm feeling gloopy, which was gloopy, which was a combination of gloomy and droopy, which kind of summed it up. But I can't really get much closer to it than that. I mean, despair's a funny word. It's a strange feeling, and it is very different to depression.
It's related to hopelessness, though, isn't it?
There's something a bit juicy about despair, which there isn't about depression, I don't think.
Yeah, depression's more stuck. That's
yes,
right,
yes, yeah. But there was also I just felt I had to drop all the spiritual techniques I'd been practicing. I mean, I'd been meditating, I'd been doing one or two other spiritual techniques very assiduously. I mean, I'm quite a disciplined person. When I put my mind to doing things like that, I just couldn't practice those anymore at that time.
Yeah.
I just couldn't. And what seemed to replace that was there just seemed to be a kind of constant looking. It was like, there is something just beyond where I can see that I'm not getting, and if I just look hard enough, then maybe it will reveal itself. There was that kind of feeling going on.
Okay, and this went on until the clothes shop, is that right?
Basically, yes.
You were buying your son a new suit, is that right?
Absolutely, I recommend that, yeah. As a technique, definitely.
Was it in Fulham, is that right?
No.
Okay. Where was it?
It was in a small country town on
okay.
the border of East Sussex and Kent.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what happened then?
There was a longer and complete disappearance of the person.
You were actually standing in the shop?
Yeah. What's the easiest way to describe this? Again, there was this complete disappearance of the person, the seeing of, if you like, the complete irrelevancy, the non-necessity of the person, the seeing of the person as a complete fabrication or an appearance, if you like. So the person disappeared. This lasted for a longer period of time. And it's extremely difficult to put this into words, but the way I've tried to describe it subsequently in my writing, and kind of looking back and, if you like, connecting up and comparing these two events, all I can say is that although what was seen in that disappearance was complete emptiness, the void, the abyss, These are words that are commonly used to describe this in different spiritual and religious traditions, for example, in both the Buddhist tradition and the Christian tradition, for example, in traditions as far apart as that although the complete emptiness of everything was seen, it was also seen to be full of love, to be absolutely full of love. And so this mysterious statement that is made in all the religions of the world and all the spiritual paths and all the teachers, and they talk about unconditional love, and the mind thinks, what does that mean, and how can everything be unconditional love when you see what's going on in the world, and what nonsense is this that all of these fine people have been writing and saying over thousands of years. And suddenly it's just seen that, oh, by golly, they're right.
That more permanent?
So the only way I've ever been able to find, the only words I've ever been able to find to describe this is that after a while, a sense of location came back. So for a while there was no person, no location, simply awareness. And then after a while, a sense of location came back. So a sense of awareness being located in a physical body came back.
Must have been quite hard with that sense of location, wasn't it? Wasn't that quite hard in day-to-day life, or did you feel you adapted, or
no? Well, what do you mean when it came back?
Well, you're saying to start with, you didn't feel a location. I would think that would be quite hard.
Absolutely not. No, because again, it transpires somewhat surprisingly that is completely unnecessary. So everything simply goes on.
And your mind was kind of...
Well, there was no my mind.
But you must have had thoughts.
There were thoughts arising. Language really breaks down in trying to describe this, even if I say that awareness was seen to be everywhere, that's not accurate, because everywhere implies space, and it implies difference in a way. If there's everywhere, then within that there's over here and over there, and even that isn't accurate. It's seen, if you like, there's no space. There is just awareness. There is simply oneness. There is simply non-separation, non-duality. And there was no difficulty in that whatsoever, no. Because again, it was just seen that the sense of being a separate person is unnecessary, let's say.
Okay.
And then when the physical location came back, if you like, the sense of being localized, as I call it, came back, that also was not a problem, because the sense of contraction, the sense of being a contracted individual, had gone.
Okay. Well, it's quite a story.
And it's a common story.
Yeah.
That's something to say as well. And other people describe the indescribable in their own, or attempt to describe the indescribable in their own words. And it is quite easy to recognise, I think, in spite of the different words that are used, it's quite easy to recognise what I'm talking about in many, many, many other descriptions. I think it's easy to recognise it in say Tony Parsons' description of walking through a park. I think it's easy to recognise in Nathan Gill, another person who's written about non-duality, in some of his description, and many, many other descriptions.
So one thing that I'm interested in exploring more is, like, I think you used the word character rather than personality in your books. Yeah. Do you feel the character that was Richard, was Richard, whatever, do you feel that in itself is still there to some extent?
Absolutely.
Do you feel that...
Not just to some extent, to a very great extent.
Okay, so your preferences and your history, they arise, but you don't feel the necessity to give them energy to... You're smiling now, so just say what you think to say.
Well, I don't know how I describe it. A preference arises and then it's either acted on or it isn't.
Okay.
That's the best way I could describe it. But that, you see, I would say that is actually what always happens for everyone. It's simply that where there's a sense of a contracted person there, they may be added onto that, this sensation that, oh, I'm choosing to do this, or I'm choosing to avoid that.
But do you feel that character has changed over the last 4 years?
In some ways. But I don't think that there are any... I mean, one of the things I say and I hold to is I feel there are no necessary implications in this whatsoever. In other words, I mean, whatever we want to call this, I mean, or if we give this no name at all, because words like liberation and awakening in a sense are nonsense anyway, whatever we want to call it, or if we give it no name at all, there are no necessary implications in it. There are no necessary rewards in it. There are certainly no rewards for a person. And this is one of the most shocking things that's seen after let's say, 3 decades of following spiritual paths and being quite convinced that there were major goodies to be had for me.
No, I understand
at
that.
the end of it, really major goodies.
Yeah.
Constant eternal bliss, maybe an enormous golden halo, perhaps a wonderful purple aura.
That's how it's packaged sometimes,
It's how
isn't
it's
it?
packaged,
Yeah.
absolutely.
It's seductive.
Absolutely, very seductive. And I've been involved with several different paths which did packages in exactly that way. Yeah.
Richard, do you feel the work that you did over those 30 years, do you think it contributed to what happened? Was there any relationship there?
I think I'd give 2 answers to that question. These may sound paradoxical. I hope they don't sound absolutely contradictory. I mean, the first and the simplest answer I would give is no, absolutely not. There is nothing that the person does, that the apparent person does, that can make the apparent person fall away. So that would be my simplest answer. I would just say no. My other answer would be, I would say it makes no difference, because it's seen that there is absolutely no choice about any of that anyway. So, in a sense, I could say, I don't mean this in a kind of dismissive way, but I could say, who cares, in a way? Who cares, in a way? Who cares whether meditating makes a difference or doesn't, or psychotherapy makes a difference or doesn't, or having our chakras cleansed makes a difference, or going and being blessed by gurus and taking Shaktipat and receiving darshan makes a difference or not? In a sense, I'm saying, who cares? Because there's no choice about any of that. That either happens or it doesn't happen, and one of the things that's seen is that there is nobody choosing to do that, there's nobody causing that to happen. So in a sense, the question becomes irrelevant. But
do you feel that if it, say, happened to you and you had no past history of meditation or any understanding, any framework to understand it, do you think the transformation would have been as smooth? It's been relatively smooth for you, because at least you have a context of which to understand what happens. If it happens out of the blue, maybe that's very difficult.
Well, it's an impossible question to answer. I mean, I don't know is the honest answer to that, but I mean, 2 things I would add to that is that the apparent past, the apparent history of this character might well have made the difference about there being an impulse here to communicate about it. To write books, to give television interviews about it. Yeah. I mean, this is seen by many, many people who never communicate about it. They never talk about it to anybody because there just isn't that kind of personality there. So maybe the fact that I'd always been a communicator, I'd always been a teacher, and I'd been very involved with spiritual paths, I'd taught meditation for many years, maybe that contributed to let's call it a preference arising for talking and writing about this rather than keeping quiet about it.
Because how you communicate what's happened or what is happening is through your character.
Of course, absolutely.
And that it has your language, it has
Absolutely.
your expression, it has your thought process.
Absolutely. I'd say there are some people now, there are some people who are writing about non-duality, talking about non-duality, giving interviews on television about non-duality in a very clear way indeed, but each of them has their own different flavour, and that comes from the character.
Yeah.
Some of them tell jokes, some of them don't tell jokes. Some of them are rather ascetic, some of them are rather profane. That's just the character.
It's interesting. I was just talking earlier to Jeff about. Are you aware of John Wren Lewis? The work he's done at all? He's
I'm not. No.
English guy who lives in Australia, and I only met him once many years ago, and I want to get in contact with him again now because he seems to have written a book which hasn't been published yet, and it talks about his investigations into people that have awakened, let's say. And he took 17 people who he's met and spent time with, and only 14 of them had done any prior spiritual work. And that includes him, because he had done no prior spiritual work, but he had this experience where he was actually in India travelling, and he was given a sweet, which was poison, because what people apparently did at that time was they give you a poison sweet, then steal your bags because you're unconscious. And they gave him a sweet, he became poisoned, unconscious. He was with his wife who didn't eat the sweet, she was okay. He went off to hospital, and he had a near-death experience, which was in fact more a near-death experience, because afterwards his reality was totally different story from you, but there was something completely different, and he again felt there was no self. And he had done ironically no previous work, although his wife had done loads of work. That's often the way. And that spurred him on to investigate other people. And I thought it was very interesting that 75% of the people that he researched had done no work at all. Something just happened.
Well, firstly, we're kind of developing quite an interesting list of techniques for your viewers. Take poison sweets, buy your son a suit.
Well, that's not officially endorsed, that one.
Don't do this at home. Hang around at major London railway stations. Walk through London parks. I've forgotten what the other thing I was going to say to that was. But yes, no, it's... yeah.
The other thing that I've found in common with other people I've talked to over the years is they pretty much say in their own words, this is kind of a bit of a summary, but the background becomes the foreground and the foreground becomes the background. Things kind of switch around. Would that be something you would connect with?
Not necessarily.
No, okay.
I think, again, words are difficult. I mean, I think if I was trying to sum this up in a kind of simple way, and maybe that's what that is getting at, I don't know, I would say is this sounds very prosaic, but its effect isn't prosaic. There is, it seems to me, at the heart of this, the seeing. Once the person has left the premises, there is the seeing that this is enough in itself. This is it, and this is enough. We don't need anything else. This is absolutely fascinating and absolutely miraculous in itself. And that maybe, I don't know, but maybe that's what is meant by describing what was in the background coming into the foreground. Perhaps, I don't know. And I have just remembered the other thing I was going to say, talking about this chap and his research. There is a book, I believe it's called Superconsciousness Revisited, and I can't remember the author, but he did a similar kind of analysis. He did an analysis of all sorts of people who, from their descriptions, he felt had let's call this an awakening, or had seen liberation, or however we want to put it. And he came to similar conclusions, that not very many of them had meditated, not very many of them had been on spiritual paths, not very many of them were in circumstances where you might expect a kind of feeling of magic to sort of alight from the heavens on us. They weren't sort of standing on mountains watching beautiful sunsets or anything like that. And he came to the conclusion that really there was absolutely nothing either practical or factual that you could connect this to.
Yeah.
It's either seen or it isn't seen.
It's like a grace of God thing in a way.
If you like, yeah, if you like. Yes, it's grace. Yes, if you like.
But there again, if you're an intelligent person and you're not happy with your life, it's pretty stupid not to seek somehow.
Absolutely, yeah.
So you have no alternative, and that's the dilemma.
I would say that where there's a sense of a person there, seeking can't be avoided. You know, there will always be seeking. I mean, it may be what we might call spiritual seeking. It might be simply seeking for a faster car, you know, or a faster woman, or a faster greyhound, or both, or all of these.
But you burn through that after a time, and
not everybody does. A lot of people get stuck on that, but yeah, a lot of people burn through it and move on to other forms of seeking. But I'd say it's impossible not to seek for a person.
Do you have advice for people? You know, people whose lives don't work, and they tried their seeking, it still doesn't work. What would you say to someone like that?
Well, I could make several different answers to that, I suppose. From a non-duality angle, I'd say I have absolutely no advice for anybody. As a trained counsellor and counselling trainer myself, because I've been professionally trained not to give advice anyway. But I mean, having said that, I mean, leaving that aside, I don't mean to be, you know, entirely flippant. Leaving that aside, I'd say for a person who feels themselves to be uncomfortable and unhappy, there are many effective things which that person can do, which might well have the effect of making them feel less unhappy and less uncomfortable as a person. I don't feel that any of those things have anything to do with what we're talking about.
I understand, yeah.
But
it's helping the character, helping the personality become more balanced. Would you say that's what?
It may well be, yes, absolutely. I mean,
so they're happier as a human being, but
more comfortable.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I mean, a common metaphor, it's in my book, but it's not my original metaphor, of course, is the metaphor of somebody who's in a prison, you know, making the prison more comfortable. If we perceive ourselves to be in a prison, then probably the most sensible thing we can possibly do is to make that prison more comfortable. And what this is about is eventually seeing that there is no prison. And there is no person in the prison, because there is no person. It's the very sense of being a person, that sort of sense of being somewhat contracted and somewhat constricted. It's that sense which creates the sense that I'm in a prison. But as long as that's there, and as long as there's a feeling, you know, that I'm a person who can make choices about my life which will affect it for good or for ill, then probably about the most sensible thing I can do is learn a good practical meditation technique, maybe have some therapy of some kind if I feel that's appropriate, look after myself in innumerable ways. You know, I mean, in a sense, it's not rocket science. You know, I mean, if you and I wanted to spend the next little while kind of compiling a handbook for how to have a more contented life, I'm sure we could come up with something very effective in about 4 minutes. You know, it isn't rocket science. And I would still say that none of that has anything to do with what we're talking about.
That's the
here.
frustrating thing.
That's
isn't
the
it?
frustrating thing.
That
very frustrating.
The ultimate solution, although that's not quite the right words, it seems you can't do anything about getting there. It either happens or it doesn't happen.
Yes, that is the ultimate frustration.
Yeah.
I mean, there are lots of different reactions from different people hearing this, of which being completely uninterested is probably the majority reaction. Most people probably just go away because they're not interested. But those who stay and listen because they are interested, one of the common reactions is anger. And that's certainly a reaction that I had when I heard this. It's very understandable. Yeah. It's almost like, I'll use this metaphor because it popped into my head. It's a very violent metaphor, but it's almost going to hear somebody talking about this when we're seeking and when we're feeling unhappy and we want guidance. It's almost like having somebody slap you around the face. It can feel like that. I'm not saying it is, but it can be perceived like that. And anger's a very common reaction to hearing this. Yeah.
People that are close to you and have known you for a time, Do they realise something significant's happened to you? Or do they just see you as the same Richard?
I don't know. I think you'd probably... I don't think I'm going to
Do they
comment
say
on
anything,
that. I think I'm easier to get along with, but they might not agree. I think the sense of the contracted person often carries a lot of neurosis with it, and I think neurosis can make us difficult to be around for other people. And although I would insist that there are no necessary implications of this whatsoever, nevertheless I think again, talking to other people, it's probably a fairly common experience that a certain amount of neurosis drops away. And that may have the effect of making the character easier to be around for other people. But I think ultimately you have to ask the other people about that.
Yeah. Okay, I promised Julian at your publishing company, the Non-Duality Press, that I'd do a little plug for the books at the
wonderful.
end.
Great
And the
stuff.
first one is I Hope You Die Soon, which is a really, on the face of it, a rather ironical title. Do you want to explain how you got that title?
I got that title from Tony Parsons. At a period of what I've already described as despair, I used to go and visit Tony at his meetings, and I also used to pester him on the phone and see if he had any advice, which of course he never did have. And I went up to him at the end of one of his meetings in despair, as I often was at that time, and he gave me a very warm hug and looked me in the eyes, and he just said, "I hope you die soon." And I thought that was a very, very kind thing for him to say in the context.
Yeah.
And so that became the title of the book. It is, of course, a metaphorical death that I'm talking about there, although that's a title that's often misunderstood by people.
Yes, I can imagine, actually, yeah. And you also have the book of No One, which is just out, your new book.
Literally hot off the presses.
Which is pretty thick, this one. It's kind of...
Indeed, yeah. There's an awful lot to be said about nothing.
It's mainly extracts from talks, is it?
It's talks and dialogues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to thank you very much for coming in today, Richard.
Thank you.
And talking to Conscious TV. And thank you for watching Conscious TV. We'll see you again soon. Goodbye.